My name is Saamiya Seraj, and the pronouns I use are she and her, and I'm the CEO of A Better Force. I'm passionate about using inclusive language because as an Asian American, Desi woman, and an immigrant to the US, I've seen firsthand the power of language and how the words people use can either make you feel safe and included or completely ostracize you. And so today, the first term that I would like to share with you is AAPI. And what this acronym stands for is Asian American Pacific Islander. And it's an acronym that is used to talk about the over 22 million people of Asian descent that reside in the United States currently. And this actually comprises of over 40 countries in the continent of Asia, as well as 25,000 islands in the Pacific Ocean. Now, this acronym was derived from the term Asian American, which originated as an umbrella term for political organizing and solidarity. But this broad classification is what makes this term a widely debated one because many Asian Americans don't feel they get adequately represented by it. Which brings me to certain variation of the term and its acronyms. We learned about the term AAPI, but another variation of it is AANHPI, which stands for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. This variation came about after 1997, when the racial classification of Asian or Pacific Islander was divided into two groups, Asian and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. This term is really important because it serves to emphasize Pacific Islanders and remind people of the history of wars and imperialism that plagued these islands in the Pacific Ocean when they were taken over as US territories. Similarly, sometimes South Asians feel like they're not adequately represented in the AAPI label. So you'll see the acronym APIDA, which stands for Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi American. Each variation has its own set of debates. So a good tip is to always ask the person how they would like to be identified. Many Asian American and Pacific Islanders often choose to be identified by their specific ethnicity. For example, I often say, I'm Bangladeshi American. The other issue that happens when you have an umbrella term for such a large group, remember what I said, the term AAPI is used to denote 22 million people living in the US from 40 different countries and 25,000 islands. So when you take such a large group and you aggregate statistics, things tend to get misrepresented. For example, a stereotype for Asian Americans is that they're really wealthy. But if you break down the group, you'll see that there's a big disparity in wealth, with some Asian American groups being among the highest earners in the US, while others are in the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Before I move on to my next term, I do want to address that the AAPI community has a lot of myths and stereotypes attached to it, including the model minority myth, which makes people assume that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders don't face as much racism. And that's inaccurate because since the pandemic started, hate crimes and violence against the AAPI community have increased dramatically. AAPI, people in the AI community are also have one of the lowest help-seeking rate for mental health issues. And so they're likely to suffer hate crimes in silence. So to everyone listening, I will ask you, be sure to reach out to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in your community, be their ally, and don't let them suffer in silence. So the next term that I want to talk about is women of color. In writing, it is often sometimes written as WOC, but when we talk about it in speech, people usually say the full term, women of color. Like AAPI and Asian American, this is an umbrella term that was used to describe non-white women, and it emerged as a solidarity term to rally under the feminist movement because the feminist movement of 1960s centered around middle-aged white women and did not take into account the unique challenges that women of color face in terms of very specific socioeconomic disadvantages. The term women of color is really important because women of color stand at the intersection of multiple barriers. They face not only gender discrimination, they also face racial discrimination, and they face the combined effect of racial and gender discrimination. There's also a lot of stereotypes for women of color in media, things like the angry Black lady or the Asian dragon lady. And what happens is these stereotypes and deep rooted discrimination often devalues the work and deprioritizes the needs for women of color. For example, they are really underrepresented in health studies and often don't have access to quality healthcare. Research has shown that a lot of times the pain and medical issues of women of color are not taken seriously, and they get underrepresented in leadership positions. And when they do actually get to these positions, their expertise and knowledge is often challenged. And so because of these and these longstanding socioeconomic inequities, women of color were also one of the hardest group that got hit in the pandemic. So if you have women of color in your life, or in your professional environment, or in your team, a really good way to be allies to them is by uplifting their voice. If you see someone playing double standards or doubting their qualifications, speak up. If you manage women of color in your office, see how you can ease their barriers and support them better, because they're often some of the most invisible and harassed groups in professional settings. A word of caution when you're using this term, because it is an umbrella term, it is much better to use specific racial group when you're talking about specific issues that affect that group. For example, you can say, instead of using women of color, you can say, US has had a long and problematic history with fetishizing Asian women, because that is something that Asian women have had a lot of trouble with in the US. Or you can say Black women have the lowest maternal mortality rate in the US, because that is a problem that Black women specifically face in the US. That's actually all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you will continue to learn about these terms and use it in your language and your journey as an ally. But I also want you to understand that no term can hold a group perfectly. For example, I am Asian American and I am a woman of color, but I'm a lot more than simply the boxes I tick. Thank you.